Welcome, everyone. Thank you all so much for coming tonight. I'm thrilled to welcome you here to a conversation with the artists featured in our current exhibition, Documenting Dreams, Juana Estrada Hernández and Humberto Saenz. Juana Estrada Hernández joins us from Fort Hays State University in Kansas, where she is assistant professor of printmaking. She received her BFA in printmaking at Fort Hays State and her MFA in printmaking at the University of New Mexico in Albuquerque. She's exhibited her artwork nationally and internationally, including in Mexico, Canada, the UK, and Poland. And her work is also held in several collections, including the University of New Mexico Art Museum, Chicago Printmakers Collective, Zygote Press, Archives, the National Library and Archives of Quebec, and the Bernard A. Zuckerman Museum of Art. Humberto Saenz comes to us from the University of Texas at San Antonio, where he is an assistant professor of printmaking and graduate studio professor of interdisciplinary art. He completed his BA at Baylor University and received his MFA in printmaking at the University of Dallas. His artwork is held in numerous collections across the US and internationally, including the Museum of Texas Tech, Dishman Art Museum, LaSalle University Art Museum, and in Monterrey, Mexico, Whakatane, New Zealand, and Peso de Regua, Portugal. His work has also been featured in publications such as the Art and Print magazine, Printmaking and Print exhibitions, and the Journal of the Print World. So both Juana and Humberto were selected as prize winners from the Spring 2020 Turner exhibition, The Fierce Urgency of Now, Socially Engaged Printmaking, juried by Aaron Coleman. And we're so excited to have them back in this joint show. I hope many of you have already been to see the exhibition, and if not, we'll have the galleries open tonight after this. But their work really offers a powerful reflection on the immigrant experience and explores notions of home, heritage, and cultural pride. And we're particularly proud to present this exhibition at Chico State, a Hispanic serving institution, and hope it will speak to many of you in the community. So tonight, I'm excited to kick off a conversation. We'll plan to have a discussion between the three of us for the first 30 minutes or so, and then leave plenty of time for questions from all of you at the end. So please join me in welcoming Juana and Humberto. Checking that the mics are go.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hello?
Yay. So I know that there are many aspiring artists here today. You've been working with a lot of our art students, and I think that a lot of people in the audience would really love to hear a bit more about your path to printmaking and your journey, through the art world to this point today, if you want to start with that.
Well, hi, everyone. Thank you for being here and allowing us to share our time with you and allowing us to present our work to you, our stories, our narratives. So I guess my journey to printmaking started in undergrad. When I finally got to Fort Hays State University, I knew that I wanted to do something within art. I just wasn't really sure. Actually, if I'm being honest, I didn't really imagine a straight path in the arts right away, and a lot of it had to do with the fact that I didn't really have solid, professional examples of that in my family. I was the first generation student to ever go to college, so I was like, maybe I should do something in science. I love science, but I think I've always been an artist at heart. I was always drawing, I was always making things, and so when I finally discovered printmaking, I was like, what is this? Oh, you draw and you paint and you cut and you roll and you do all kinds of stuff, and then you get to make multiples of something, and not everything exactly has to look the same. It was very exciting, and it just provided a lot of opportunities to experiment, and then once I discovered printmaking, I kind of never stopped and never went back. So yeah, and then I ended up in New Mexico, and now I'm here.
Okay, my turn. So I guess I started off going to Baylor University. I was going for architecture school. And then, so I was doing my final year residency in architecture school. And I kind of got tired of making straight lines. And so I was like, okay, let me try something else. And I had a really great undergraduate professor who kind of guided me in trying to figure out what I wanted to do, with my life. And so he was like, you should try out printmaking. And I had no idea what it was, right? And so I was like, okay. And like the first thing was he made me do a litho on a stone. And then I was like, you can draw on a stone. That's awesome. And so then after that, it was like, I couldn't stop doing it. And for some reason, like I really liked it. And then I went to graduate school, and it just kind of kept growing for me, like just learning all the different mediums and just techniques. And I'm very kind of recipe oriented, so printmaking for me was pretty natural because I could follow things along. And then finally, I was thinking about like how to, hone my craft and how to really make, something that I felt was interesting, not just for me, but also for my community. And so I started being more active in politics, and I started being more as an activist artist. And so that's really where like I really started making my work as it stands now. And that had a lot to do with, we went on strikes and we went on marches in about the 2006 election in Dallas, and we had a lot of like political activism happening in Dallas, Texas, and so that's how I got into making political artwork.
Thank you. Yeah, I think we're gonna look at some examples of both of your political pieces. But I love what you mentioned also about the importance of mentorship and having somebody who believed in you and showed you a path forward that maybe you didn't know was there. And I know, Juana, you've also mentioned that there's been some people in your career path that have helped you along the way.
Yeah, and I think as far as like the way that I think about mentors, they have I had a printmaking mentor, Gordon Sherman, who recently passed away, but he was like my art mentor. I have Hector Villanueva, who was academic advisor, he was a mentor, and he got me to college to begin with, right? Like he put me through the door, and I've had family support me and friends, and just kind of, I've grown a network that has met me where I needed it. And so, I guess like in terms of mentorship, like that was really important to get as far as I have. And and then I like how Humberto talked about, the journey in which kind of shaped his work and the way that it's now. And I think mine too. Mine was more about really, like in undergrad early on, my mentor was like, hey, like, I was making work about like, I was making like schools and animals and like just kind of all over. And, my mentor was just like, hey, why don't you he's like, I'm not telling you what to make, but what if you make something that, like what is it that you're feeling that has to be put out there? Like what's happening in your life that you can make work about? And I was like, well, at that time, I was not only like finding my voice in art, but also during that time, I really was contemplating figuring out what it meant to be like documented and like really not really having, I guess like a way to really talk about it verbally. So I said, okay, let's do this visually. And so that's where I started introducing politics into my work, processing that experience. And then of course, for the folks who are, I guess like aware of what's happening, like today, that's something that's being litigated right now, but, and then too, what do I know best is my life and my experience, and so I felt like I just needed to put that out there, and, I just made it because I felt like I needed to put it out there and process it, and, I guess now there's a community that is responding to it, and, like I didn't make it for anybody per se. In the beginning, it was just more to process. And I've kind of been doing that, over time, and, now the work that you see now in the gallery is kind of where I'm at most currently.
Yeah. Well, let me see. Oh, there we go. I've started with these two pieces, which are in the first section of the exhibition. which is thinking about the role of children and childhood. It's sort of a recurring theme in both of your work. And since you're coming at the political issues like immigration, the border crisis, what does it mean to take the perspective of a child? What drew you to that aspect of your work in particular?
Well, for me, I was raised in the U.S. Mexico border in the Rio Grande Valley in Texas, and so for me, it was never pressing kind of a political issue that immigration was a part of daily life, right? And so not only do people immigrate to the U.S. to live, but also just coming into work and then going back, right? So for me, it was kind of not a different experience, but it was like a natural experience that was always happening around me. And then later on now, when we look at politics and the separation of children from their families, has been a really big issue for me because I immigrated here as a child, and so that could have changed a lot if it would have been done during that time. And so it's a very kind of like important issue for me. So I use children who are playing at war in this playful kind of thing that you do when you're a child, where you like get guns, Nerf guns, things like that, and then you play, right? But the children in my prints are playing against an unknown assailant, an unknown force, an authority, if you will. And you don't see them, you just see the children playing. But the idea is that the children are being forced to do certain things without their knowledge or their consent because they have no options, right? And so for me to represent them, I think it's for me as an artist, it's important because they have a voice. And so I'm trying to give voice to them.
Well, for me, in terms of, like how childhood shows up in my work, I'm glad that Humberto brought up what's happening with the zero tolerance policy, where they were separating children with their mothers in the U.S. southern border. For me, I think that that is something that is definitely present in the most current work because it's happening, like it's just happening and it's still happening. But then also to my family. And my family and I like have that experience of like migrating through the desert. Like I have like lived experience, and I don't really wish that on anyone. But so like for me, it comes from like experience, but then also it's been kind of interesting, just because I've grown up most of my I guess teenage and adulthood life in the United States, and I have nieces and nephews now who are a lot younger, and so it's like, how do you, in a way, like talk about these experiences in a way that, like, I don't know, like doesn't traumatize them, but still like it's part of our familial history and experience, and so like in my work, when as far as like the childhood aspect, I actually started making work for them. I think it was maybe it was halfway through grad school. My family came down to visit me in Albuquerque. And when they got there, the oldest at the time, she must have been 8 or 9. And they were like driving down to New Mexico, but she thought they were driving to Mexico. And so they were like, we're going to Mexico. And we're like, no, this is New Mexico. But in that drive, they asked my parents like all these questions, like, hey, where are we going? Like, where are we from? We're going to Mexico. And they were like, no, we're going to New Mexico. And they kept asking like, hey, why can't we go to Mexico? And so they had all these like gaps in their knowledge about our familial history. And so I was like, oh, wow. So they really, like, even though it's one generation apart, they still there's a lot that they don't know. And so my work, I was like, okay, how do I visually record these experiences in a way that's genuine, but then also is educational for them. I see my work as almost like an archive of my family's experience, but then at the same time, I'm still very cognizant that these themes are bigger than just from my own family. Like as folks who have like that immigrant experience in their family, like these are like intergenerational experiences, and so in an odd way, like I started making work for them, but at the same time, like I kind of, I still have that experience too. So in a way, it's like doubled, kind of double that experience.
Yeah, I love hearing about, thinking about the audience of your work and speaking to people of different ages, of different backgrounds. I think there's a really, there's a serious element and there's also a playful one. I'm thinking about these images, of the piñata, of this sort of festive moment, but then in a lot of your work, Humberto, you're really transforming people and objects through this, through these colors and these textures. And I was wondering if you could share, a bit more about this series in particular and what it meant to really take something iconic like that and transform it in the way that you have.
Thank you. So for the most part, I guess for me, living in the U.S., being an immigrant, and then, I went to Baylor for undergrad, and then I went to Dallas, and I kind of been moving up I-35, so it was kind of interesting because I'm like constantly migrating, and then I moved back and I moved south of 35, but now in San Antonio, right? So this idea of like identity migrating and how your identity is shaped by the environment that you live in. And so during my thinking of this, I was actually working on Dante's Inferno. So I have like this huge series of Dante's Inferno's prints. And I was like thinking about politics and how, the book was written and how that kind of changed like how people viewed politics and people in power. And so my idea was, okay, I need to find like signifiers or symbolism in my own culture to then kind of show through my work, right? And so I arrived at the piñata because the piñata is like an object, right? That's really kind of, whenever like I had a birthday party with my friends, they would always be like, oh, like let's get Humberto a piñata. And I was already in college, and so we'd get a piñata. And so it was pretty interesting to me like that my friends would always like kind of be like, we need a piñata for Humberto, right? So it's kind of cool. But like it was like, oh, like how do I use that in my work? And so I started thinking about what the piñata actually signifies. And so my idea is that the piñata is a signifier of me, of my culture, but it's also a way that, people are taking away their identity. It's like you put a stereotype over everybody, and it's like a piñata, everybody should have piñata. And so my idea was that the piñata is that signifier of the loss of identity into an object, right? Where like the object is like the symbol that carries your identity. And so I started looking at issues that would happen on the border, and I would look at read articles, and then I would kind of make the image and then turn the objects into piñatas or turn the people into piñatas, just robbing them of that kind of identity that they had, but in a way kind of showing that it was more a universal issue rather than just every particular person. And so that's what I did for this series of works. And so, like for instance, the one on the right, the kids were in the U.S.-Mexico border. There were some kids playing out in the field, and then a Border Patrol agent shot into the brush, and the kids were playing like behind it, so one of them got hit by one of the bullets, and so that's the one that you see here. And then everything on the outside that looks kind of like the like confetti, if you will, that's actually all the pencil shavings of all the drawing that I did. So every time I like sharpen my pencil, I would keep this pencil shavings, kind of like in a way of recycling this idea of like it's not all gone, and so like it makes it kind of be all together always, right? So for me, that was kind of my sense of it, at least.
Wow. Yeah, I didn't know that about the background. It's such an amazing texture that you've captured. That's really an interesting technical detail. And thinking about the piñata as a symbol, I mean, it's something that's full but then emptied at the same time. It comes out at a moment of celebration, but there's also this loss as it's burst. There's a lot going on there.
Yeah, I find the ritual of the piñata kind of interesting. Mm-hmm. I had it when I was little, like my mom would buy the piñatas and stuff, but this idea of like getting like a bat or a stick and then you hit a piñata, and then it's usually like Dora the Explorer or Mickey Mouse or something like that, right? So it's something fun, but then you're like hitting it. And so this kind of like weird kind of ritual that happens, right? But then you hit it enough, and then you get candy out of it, and then there's like another step to that. And so to me, it was always very interesting that, you know, there was this kind of like situational accidents that happened because of the ritual that was just kind of, to me, not necessarily something I wanted to keep doing.
Yeah, we have also Juana's piece up in the top left there, and you've got that exact moment and the blindfold and the mother and her daughter. Yeah, it's great to have these pieces together. And I wanted to bring up the idea of these sort of signifiers because I know in your work, Juana, food, especially corn, we have all these different manifestations of corn as a really important symbol for you of heritage. And I was wondering if you wanted to share more about how that's sort of developing in your work over time.
Yeah, so amongst like my prints, most of the figures that you see are either like literally members of my family that are sort of interacting with like the symbols that I provided on the page. But lately I have been like not recycling, but just like keep using that symbol of the corn, because like corn, it's kind of like essential, like it's in everything that we have in terms of like our culture, like it's in food. You can like plant it, it's kind of like everywhere, but I guess like the latest iteration, like when I think of, like the print up there's like a version of it just like growing, there's a version of it being like made into like tamales, there's like a version of it just growing in the backyard. So like, of course, like it's these like physical ways that it can show up, but like really, I'm just really interested in figuring out ways in which we pass knowledge through food, intergenerationally speaking. And my mom, she's really big into cooking. Growing up, my dad, he worked. My mom stayed at home. She would like cook for us like 3 times a day. Being older, like I didn't realize that was unusual. Like that was just not the norm for most people. And so, so as far as like the food aspect, of course, like I have these like special memories of the way that, my mom, like now being older, I was like, man, like maybe I shouldn't have been so frustrated that she wanted us to come and help her make something, because the reality is like once she's gone, then if I don't ask her or like spend time with her to like know how to make or prepare things, then I'm gonna lose that knowledge. Maybe I can ask my siblings that are older. But for me, as far as like the food aspect goes, that's one component. But also it brings people together, right? To like share space together, whether that's good or bad in a family dinner table setting. The corn too, like historically speaking, like there used to be a lot of varieties too before like colonization, and like now I think we've kind of come to this like standard like just yellow corn on the cob sort of version, but before there used to be a lot of varieties with a lot of like colored seeds. And so again, like when I was living in New Mexico, I was able to participate in this program called Landlords of the American West, and we got to meet people who, again, like talking about like protecting knowledge and passing down these seeds. Like there was people who had collected seeds of corn for generations, and they dried them out and they kept them safe, and these were versions that haven't been altered by like large like agricultural companies and things like that. And but then also too, like I love food. I love eating it. It's cultural. I mean, I like the like elote with like the crema and the chile. Like it's also too like this. It brings me back to my like childhood, all the things that we could eat all the time, and but I think that also too, I've also seen that in terms of just like the folks who like look at the work, they can always, even if they don't maybe share like that cultural background with me, they can always identify that in some aspect and be like, oh, we can make a connection that way with food too.
Yeah, I love the idea of, starting with your own experience, your own family, then excavating these intergenerational stories, and then going back into this deep history of, of pre-Columbian Mesoamerican time. I mean, this is an issue in your work as well, Humberto, where you're combining these amazing, historical, mythological figures with our contemporary world. And I'm curious about that, how you're bringing those into dialogue, and how much research did you do? Was this really getting into the archives, or is it more thinking, did you start more from a contemporary perspective and come at it from that angle?
Yeah, well, actually, I started doing this research back in like 2000, I think 6 or 7. I'm not entirely sure now, but basically, in graduate school, you have to make art, and then you do critiques, right? And then you make art and you do critiques, and just like an undergrad. But I was doing research on my own culture because I had been removed from it for such a long time, and so I felt like I needed to be informed more about it, and really look at writings from pre-Columbian texts and so forth. And so what I ended up doing, I guess it was probably like 6 months. I actually didn't make any work, and I just went to the library, got a whole bunch of books, and I would read on policies of immigration, policies that had been enacted, and just kind of read books for like 6 months. And I would show up to critiques and just have like images of books that I read and talk about that. And my professors would ask me questions. They were really supportive of that because it was an important aspect to my work. And so I started doing this, and so I arrived at a pre-Columbian codices or books, right? And there's very few of those left now, but some of them have been scanned by different publishing companies. And so I was actually able to get a couple of those that were scanned, and they were limited edition books. And so I would have to go to the library and kind of look at them there. And so I started thinking about, the mythology and the gods and what it would mean for a god to exist today in contemporary America. And so I started thinking about, okay, so if they were alive today and they lived in Mexico, what did they have to do? And so for me, it was kind of interesting to think about it as immigrating religion, immigrating beliefs, immigrating culture. And so the gods in this particular series are pre-Columbian gods that migrate or immigrate to the United States, and then they have to get a job. And so they perform a job or a career, right? And so they engage in contemporary America this way. And so I started making them, and so I would take pictures. I would go around taking pictures of people at random places, and they'll look at me like, "What is this person doing, taking pictures of me?" And so it was kind of interesting. And I would have conversations with people, and they would talk to me about like what they did for a living, like what had happened in their lives. And it was kind of like a really great dialogue to have with a whole bunch of different people about how they, chose their careers, what had happened in their lives. And then I would take all this information, right, and then put it into the prints. And so, for instance, the print that you see here, that's the Tondo print, the circle print. It was this person who would come in and do the lawn for my next door neighbor. And so I would talk to him, and we would sit down, and he was like, "Yeah, I kind of do it all the time, and it's kind of this cyclical thing." So I got invited to do this Tondo portfolio, which is like a group of prints. And they were like, "You have to make a round print." And it was the first one I ever made. And I was like, all right, well, what do I do it? And immigration is kind of like a cyclical thing, right? And it's so it kind of went well with like what I was doing. So it's kind of like nice. And then this idea of like manual labor and then repeating the same job over and over again. And so the god is going in a circle, and then he's like basically cutting the lawn, and as he's cutting it, it comes back around and it grows, and he's cutting it again, and they turn into petals, which are the piñata petals also. But at the same time, it's like the canister it was gonna go into was a movie film, and so I was thinking also about like rewinding the film, and then it starts again, rewinding the film. So there's a little bit of that also in there.
I love that that cyclical element. I mean, do you feel that with printmaking? I was watching you in the studio today. You know, there's so many steps. It's such a it can be a really repetitive process. It involves this manual work. Do you feel that there's an affinity with the kind of work that they were doing, or for you those are very separate?
Oh,
areas?
you know, that's a really interesting thing, because, you know, when I started doing printmaking, I kind of found solace, and I felt it's a meditative process for me to kind of engage printmaking in that way, where I just kind of keep doing it over and over again. And so, like, sometimes, like, when people are like, oh, like, how can you print for that long, or like it takes a long time, I'm like, for me, it's not. It's just kind of a way for me to kind of engage in my identity, and it allows me to really think about and contemplate about what I've been doing. And so it's really great. But I think there is this kind of idea of doing it over and over again that is kind of reassuring, and maybe, I don't know, like fundamental to who we are as human beings, because it's like day in and day out kind of situation. I don't know. What do you think, Juana? I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, there's like a lot of like labor and repetition that happens in the process. I don't know. For me, it's almost like an obsession in some regards. I find it really fun. You know, I think there's always, for the folks who have made a print before, or, you know, even if it doesn't matter how many times you do it. Like earlier today, I had a group of students who we were getting ready to print like a third color layer on the print, and while I can have a good idea of what the color is gonna do or mix, I think I was in mid-conversation with some faculty, and I looked over at the press, and I saw the student lift the paper, and I just kind of like gasped, and I was like, oh my God, that's so exciting. And it's for me, it's just really, like there's something really fun about it. It just hasn't gone away. But I do love how physical it is. There's something, I mean, we do a lot of standing, a lot of moving around, a lot of rolling. It just feels, I don't know, like natural. I don't know. I grew up landscaping with my dad, and so like I don't feel like it's so far from what I already know. And in landscaping, there was a lot of repetition, like go get the wheelbarrow, go fill it up with soil, and then come back, and then go back, and then go back, and then just over and over. Okay, you're done with the wheelbarrow? All right, go get the sod and put it in the wheelbarrow, and then go back. So, you know, it's kind of the same thing. Maybe I'm not pushing a wheelbarrow, but I'm pushing a roller, you know? But it's, so.
I feel an exhibit about printmaking and landscaping in the future here. But I think it's interesting to think about your process and connecting with the subject matter, and I'm conscious of time, so I figured we might end on this with these three images here, because you also have in a lot of your works, you have sort of steps or choices or these numbered lists, and that again I think ties into some of these things we've been talking about. And I wondered for both of you if we might finish by talking a little bit about text and language, because you know, you use a lot of text in your work. It would be great to hear more about that. And then for both of you, we had a lot of discussion for the exhibition and the gallery and for the catalog about doing the captions, doing the interpretation in both English and Spanish. We had some Spanglish titles that we were working on translating, but it was a really interesting challenge and dialogue. So I'm curious if, maybe we can finish by thinking about that kind of dual nature and what role language plays in your work as well.
Yeah, so as far as language goes, specifically about, so these three prints actually got me started in incorporating more text into my prints. Not every single one does, but just to give a little bit of context, so these prints, you know, I said earlier that I started making work, like being more cognizant of using the work to archive my family's like migration stories like visually. But in terms of just like making a print, like I really wanted, so because this was gonna be for my nieces and nephews, I'm like, how do I get them to engage in a way that isn't just like looking at the print and like looking at the visual symbols, but like what if I can also in some ways make it educational? And it wasn't, for me, it wasn't more like, grandma is doing this. It was like, no, like I wanted them to think a little bit more. So some of the questions up there, so like this specific series kind of talks about sort of like that migration journey, like the start of it or the end of it, depending on how you think about it. And so some of the questions are in Spanish. They are being raised in the United States, and so while they speak Spanish at home, they're also learning English at school. And so the aspect of Spanglish, it's like that hybrid form, right, that starts to happen not because maybe you don't necessarily care for one or the other, it just has to happen because there's a culture clash that's happening. But then, so the questions, they kind of ask like, hey, like, what do you do in this situation? They give you options, whereas sometimes it's not easy to, let's say, pick water over bread or certain items versus others. Like sometimes I feel like when you look from one print to the other, like the questions guide you to one print to the next. But then sometimes I pose questions like, hey, you actually only have two options, even though maybe you only have one option, while perhaps you need to do both things, right? And so, and then in terms of just like text, like I think about, again, like the audience, sometimes, of course, like I have no control as who walks into that gallery and looks at the work, but I do use Spanish because I'm talking to like a Spanish-speaking community. Sometimes I make the work because I want my parents to like know what it says, or like I'm speaking to them directly. And I've had the question like, oh, you're presenting this work in the United States, and I'm like, okay, well then look it up, do the work. We gotta do the work, you do the work. And then, as far as like the Spanglish go, like there's one print up there where, like they were like, this is not a word, but, again, like I grew up sometimes, even though my first language was Spanish, now being older, of course, like talking about the environment, I'm in an environment where I sometimes don't even get to speak Spanish every day anymore. That like totally changed. And so, of course, my language is gonna start to change. And, language is malleable, language is powerful, and it's bound to change. And so why not like make up words too? Like, why not?
I don't use text in my imagery, but I do use, I guess, text in titles. So my titles are kind of like there's innuendo in the titles, and because of where I was raised, and having my dad and my mom, and they're in Mexican culture, there's a lot of innuendo in the words that you use, and so they're like can mean one thing, but they can mean another, and so sometimes when you try to translate it to a different language, the context and the concept of it changes, and so usually I kind of move away from translations, and that happened early on in my career where I was like, people would translate it, and I was like, that's not really like what it means, because it could mean two things, and just like, let's say the English word, it just means one thing, or it could mean like a totally different thing than what I'm intending. So I started thinking about like, okay, do I do the translations myself? And so that's what I ended up doing in the beginning. I would translate them myself to kind of get as close as I could to what I was intending. But then eventually I was like, you know what, I'm not doing that anymore, and I'm just gonna trust the audience that they can go ahead and figure that out if they want to. And some people do, they try to look into it or look it up, and some people are they just kind of understand the work, and I'm okay with that. I think, being born in Mexico and then coming here and just experiencing how, everybody around me was talking in English, and I didn't know what they were saying, and this idea of like, oh, like I need to learn, English so that I can communicate. And I think that's where the visual part of art is really great, because art can speak to a lot of different languages, right? And so for me, that's what art opens up. It opens up a conversation and a dialogue between a whole bunch of different people. And it allows us to come together and really look at our differences and actually appreciate those differences and to be a community of people. Well, you know, if you got a lot of pencil shavings, I can give you my address. No, I'm just kidding. So part of it is, I guess, for me, is just really thinking about how material can influence the meaning of work, right? And so for this, I was looking at in Mexico, right? They have sarapes, they have different fabrics that are made, you know, they're more traditional. And there's also like these things called peceras, which are like public buses. And they usually have like on the dashboard, they have like all the fabric and they have like the little threads coming down. And so this is very reminiscent of that. And so that's where like my idea is coming from. So in the bottom, when you see it in the gallery, and it's not evident in the pictures, but in the gallery, there's the little threads coming down. And the reason you don't see it here is really hard to photograph, so I didn't do it. But the thread is actually one fabric. And so then I'm deconstructing the print as I'm actually preparing it for display. So I have to, like every single thread, I de-thread it by hand until I get to, and so every time I like different prints get de-threaded a certain amount until I kind of contemplate on what I'm thinking about. So like, then it gets tight, knotted right into for display. So for me, like the material plays a big part, but also the process of the material, like what I'm doing with the material in itself. So. Let me check.
Well, yes, my students are working right now because before I came in here, I had a student, they blew up my email. And I, in the past, like they were like, oh my God, something's not working. And they usually email me first, and then they were like, SOS, Juana, and they sent me a text, and they're like, how do we fix this? Because they have a project due when I come back. So they're kind of like, we know that you're gone, and we're not trying to bother you. But yeah, I guess like in terms of community, you know, where I'm at right now, it's my first like full-time teaching position, right, fresh out of grad school. So, you know, for me, it happened quite quickly. But in terms of just like Humberto definitely has been teaching for a lot longer. And so, you know, I definitely have a lot to learn still, but I have been able to, so like where I'm at, so I'm coming into my second year now there, and I didn't have any printmaking majors. So like I was like, I don't know what I'm doing here, but I'm supposed to like be here, hype up the students to love printmaking like I do, and I don't know if I can actually do that. We'll see. And but now my little 0 student program has grown to like 10 majors. So I'm super happy that it's grown. Thank you. But in terms of just like community, I think that they're just I guess in terms of just that, I'm really happy to be, you know, like a part of like their educational journey. And I think that because, I don't know, in some ways, like I'm younger, they're kind of, I don't know, it's like a dual thing, but double-edged sword, because it's like, they really respond to me, but then also I'm like, yeah, I'm not your friend, but I can be like your mentor. So for me, like learning how to be a good mentor is something that I'm gonna constantly have to, like, I'm open to continually growing on that. But in terms of just like my little, like, I call them like my little print gang, because for a while, it was weird. Like they like go everywhere together, and it's cool. Like I love that they have found community within themselves, and I mean, like they cook together, and they come and print together, and then like in the studio. It's been great, and but they're also very supportive, and you know, they were pretty excited for me to come out here, and I think in some ways that's also really important, like being an active like artist, because they can also see that there is like a path like forward. It's not just like once you maybe land your dream job, like that's it. Like there's so much more to like keep pursuing, and yeah, I don't know, like they were just like really happy. They were just like, just come back though. I was like, I'm gonna go teach with the students at Chico, and I'm gonna brag about them because they, but I'm sure they're gonna like step it up now, and they're gonna be like, oh, we gotta be better than the students at Chico. No, but I'm gonna say those students got down, and we got an addition done in an afternoon, and yeah, good for you. If you guys are here, yeah, good for you. But yeah, I don't know if that answers his question, but.
Me too? Okay. Well, I mean, for me, well, I guess a little bit of background. I'm an only child. So I need a community. I need a group. I need a gang. I need a lot of people, around me. And I think, printmaking is, to me, the most democratic process of art, and because you can get a lot of people involved. And so building a community shop, having a shop where everybody's welcome is always like my #1 priority. And like whenever I arrive at a new school, I'm always like, don't ever close the door to the print shop. The print shop has to stay open. And that's usually like my mantra, like everybody can come in at any time. I'll be like doing demos or something, and like 3 people show up to want to start printing. And that is, for me, like the most important thing. So I always try to have like an open dialogue and conversation with my students. It is, like anything else, it's always challenging to go and do these kind of things because you remove yourself from the shop. But, on Tuesday, they had a photo op for my class, and then they like texted me everything went all right. So, I assume it did. And then today, I had another artist come in and talk to them about grad school and going to grad school. So we're always trying to keep them involved, keep them going, even though I might not be there. There's always like a community artist, my faculty, professors and fellows that are like always willing to step up and like kind of pitch in to build that community, right? So I'm not by myself. I have a group of really talented artists that surround me that really help out, and we all kind of pitch in to kind of try to guide everybody to where they want to be.
But then also, to work in a shop, like you have to be able to like coexist with other people also. It's not just about showing up and making prints and leaving. Like sometimes you need 2 people to move things around, or maybe you need somebody to help you sponge a stone, or sometimes too, it's just like it gets really fun to be around other people and seeing what they're doing, and we are influenced by the things that we see around us, and so I can see for, at least in my example, or of my students, like I can see that my intro students, they always go to the advanced students, they're like, what are you doing? And so they kind of like look at each other, and then they really just encourage each other, and but then also to, also like if you're the person who doesn't clean up after themselves, it affects everybody else. So like you have to sort of, like the community aspect, like it's always in print, whether it's in the like a university setting, a print shop, like self-owned or wherever you go, and it's just kind of part of the medium. Well, like migration happens all over the world. It's not just like a U.S. southern border sort of thing. It just kind of permeates differently in different parts of the world. And so I think that even though my work comes from a very specific place, I think that visually it can be interpreted. It's like depending on who sees it, like they're going to interpret it differently. I recently was. Where was it? I went to, I think it was at the when I went to Wisconsin last spring for the printmaking conference, I met somebody who wasn't part of the conference. They were just like part of like the Wisconsin community, and I was showing work there, and they saw there was a print where it was like the two tamales and like the people walking, and they saw that as like Ukraine, like that they kind of were able to, like, even though this is a scene of like my mom and my dad and my older sister, and like that's a picture of my house, and you know, like they were able to like use the symbols that I gave them to put their own meaning and their own like whatever present experience that they're thinking about. And there was another person who, yeah, like maybe they were like Mexican identifying. They were like, oh yeah, like maybe we're not from Zacatecas, but we're from this other part of Mexico or Latin America, and like we can connect that way. And so yeah, like there's, especially with text, like especially if it goes somewhere else, their odds are they're probably going to speak another language. But I hope that, well, I entrust the viewer to, of course, like get their own interpretation. What they're going to take out what they will, right, on their own, but like using the symbols that I provided, hopefully like I can guide them to at least the topic of migration, immigration, and like what that means to them in their part of the world. And then also too, in some ways, yeah, like exhibiting internationally is kind of a interesting thing, because the work is like traveling, like my family is traveling the world like with my work in a symbolic way. Because of my status, I can't travel internationally, but my work is getting out there. My family's like living the life that they would love to live in a interesting sort of way, but regardless, like this idea of like borders, I mean, it just doesn't only exist in the U.S. southern border, it's everywhere.
Thank you. Don't know if you want to add anything to that, Humberto. Thank you, Juana.
No, that sounds great. It's awesome. That's what I was gonna say.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, and I guess like there's an idea too, there's a saying that like, even though we leave the border, like the border lives with us. And so it's this like sort of ephemeral sort of experience that you just never forget, but you carry with you in an embodied sort of way.
Pop quiz, right? Okay. No, I'm just kidding. So I think for me, it has really been more about like my journey as a Mexican American living in the U.S. and how that has kind of shaped my way of thinking. And most of, like, so if you look at my work, you'll see like it's a very kind of stoic kind of rendering of people. They're like not like they're kind of engaged in action, but they're not moving. And that really comes from my Western kind of teaching that I was taught. You know, like being raised in the U.S. and having this Western thought kind of process of like Greek mythology. So you'll see like David and Goliath and Zeus, and that's sort of the poses from like our history, right? But also like in the mythology, but then changing that from Western mythology to pre-Columbian mythology. And so I have this kind of dialogue, if you will, with my upraising and then my loss of my personal culture. And so there's these things that I kind of embed within the imagery that allows me to think about, you know, like not necessarily like other artists, but rather like a culture, a whole culture that has been taught to me and that was kind of like pushed on top of my other culture. And so I kind of forgot one for another, and now I'm trying to reclaim the one that, you know, my parents have given to me, my heritage.
So it's interesting because my process of determining that has changed over the years. So when I was in grad school, materials were expensive, and so my editions were a lot smaller. I'm talking like sometimes I would make an edition of 3, and that was already a lot. So speaking to the aspect of just kind of like living through that struggle of not being able to buy your own art supplies while in the MFA program. But now just kind of being outside that realm, I don't know, I like odd numbers. So I make an addition in odd numbers. Every printmaker has a different system, but a lot of it too has to do with, I think in some ways, like, I have met people who addition in high numbers, like let's say 50, an addition of 50, but that's the demand of their work. Sometimes there's printmakers who partner up with professional additioning workshop or print shops, and so maybe they're being sent by a gallery, and then the gallery will say, we need, I don't know, maybe we'll need 80 or 100 of these because your work sells really well. And so it just kind of really depends. Most of my editions right now, depending on the technique too, like printing an edition of like etchings, it's like, for me, it takes me a lot longer than making an edition of like in lithography. It's just different, and it's physically taxing in different ways. And so, but I think like within my editioning, I'm kind of in this like 15 prints, and that's actually quite small, and I'm okay with that for right now. A lot of it too has to do with like we're professional, but like full-time educators too, so it's kind of hard also to just kind of, you know, set 4 or 5 days for like editioning where you're not doing anything else beyond that. But but most times, you know, even though my final edition size, let's say, is of 15, I will print 30, because also I want to make sure that I have a margin of error so that I can like essentially pick the most consistent or more accurate prints that are going to exist within one edition. And so what do I do with the rest? I essentially just use the back of them to like test colors, or, you know, sometimes if my students help me, like I might say, this is not the greatest print. They're like, we don't care, we want it. I'm like, don't sell it though, you know, like, because
eBay.
Yeah, it's like, don't put it on eBay because they're gonna, you know, like that's not the quality that I want, right? But yeah, so everybody has a different system. I don't know. Right now I'm like at 15, and but that's also too like the demand of like where my work is at. Like it seems like, I mean, right now, I don't know. Like it seems like I'm selling a little more than usual, but regardless, like I don't think I need to be printing 50 because the demand is just not there for me right now. But everybody's system is different. I don't know. How do you come up with your number?
Well, there's two things that happen for me. So first of all, sometimes people ask me to be in a project. Mm-hmm. And so if I'm in a project, like a portfolio, and they're like, okay, we need 30 prints, then that's an automatic kind of, that's what it has to be. But then, so usually what happens in like a portfolio project, so I'll print 30, and those all go away, right? So they go into a variety of different places. But then I'm like, well, I want some for myself, so then I have to print, 40 or 50 or whatever I need. But traditionally for my own work, when I started off, I was printing anywhere between 10 and 20 prints, right? And for me, I print, back in the day, I was talking to the students earlier today, I was a little bit more a go-getter, and I wanted to be like, I'm gonna print 15 colors on one print. I'm gonna print 20 colors on one print. Like I was like going all out, But then my back happened, and I was like, okay, I need to kind of realize what's happening here, right? And so I started looking more accurately of supply and demand and economics and everything that goes in with that, and running a business as an artist. And I think, when I started, I was really looking at more like, this is what the art needs, and it's great, right? And that's what we all try to do. But then the realization has to come in of like, what is the economics of it, and how much, you put into it and get out of it. And so now I do a supply and demand thing where I print as many as I feel are gonna sell of that particular print. And sometimes I miss it, because sometimes the print that I'm like, oh, this one's gonna sell less, that's the one that sells more. And then I'm like, oh, well, I should have printed more of those. So it's always like a guessing game, right? But I think overall, it's like we can't ever know like the aesthetic that people like everybody as a whole. And so different people gravitate to different colors, different imagery, and so everybody likes their own stuff. And so I like that idea of like, how do you figure out, what people like and how they respond to it? And I think that's an ongoing process for me. So I'm always like tweaking things and finding out what works best for each imagery. And even now, I used to make purely lithos, which are really labor intensive, and I used to do stones also, and now I kind of do a mixed media where I do lithos and screen print together. And that becomes a little bit easier for me. And the students are great if they're here. Thank you so much. They're helping me out a lot, and they're printing up a storm in the print shop right now, and we're doing a litho screen print. And the litho took us, I think, like almost all day, and then we did the screen print, and we printed like 5 colors, like in a couple hours. And so it's like, boom, boom. So then there's this idea of like, what's worth more, right? Is it a litho or a screen print? And for me, it's more of the intention, right? Like conceptually, like where you're at, So a litho and a screen print should be worth the same, if you will. And so for me, it's like if you value it, then it should be that value for it, rather than the technique of it or the labor involved.
Thank you both so much, and thank you all for coming. I hope you'll join me in thanking Juana and Humberto one more time.